Good evening. Welcome back to the Deep 404. It's been a couple of weeks. I've had some other things going on, but I'm back. There's a lot to talk about. Trying to figure out just where to start. Some of you may have heard of the Ben Gurion Canal project. Some of you may have heard about the reported gas and oil resources underneath the West Bank and off the coast of Gaza in the Mediterranean. And these two topics, which are out there, readily available if you go and look for them or if you're aware of them, but don't seem to be being discussed too much in the mainstream media, may well be part of the reason of why this conflict is unfolding the way that it is in Gaza, in Israel and Gaza. The location of the Gaza Strip is interesting for a number of reasons. One, as I've just mentioned, it appears that off the coast there is a large amount of untapped gas. I'm just reading here, discoveries of natural gas in the Levant Basin are in the range of 122 trillion cubic feet, while recoverable oil is estimated at 1.7 billion barrels. This opportunity offers to distribute and share about $524 billion among the different parties in the region. Now, if this is in the West Bank, if this is in area which should be under the control of the Palestinians in Gaza, if you were to remove Palestinians from Gaza and ultimately from the West Bank, you would then be in a position, if you were Israel, to assume control over those resources. Now, there's certainly been some talk of plans, reportedly by the Israeli government, to look to find a way to displace the Palestinians from the West Bank and from Gaza. Now, there could be a number of reasons why you'd want to do that. Obviously, you don't want to have a group of people who wish to do your nation harm embedded within the area of your nation. So definitely on the surface, that reasoning makes sense. Also, though, you may have an additional driver that if in removing those people from the areas of land near or your land, you were able to unlock $500 billion estimated of oil and gas reserves, that would be some sort of influence to perhaps drive that sort of activity. Now, the Ben Gurion Canal project, interestingly enough, let's just have a look here. Make this a little bit bigger. If you can see, this is a planned canal to run just from the very northern tip of Gaza down through Israel to the top of the Gulf of Aqaba. Now, this, if it were constructed, and there have been plans since at least the 1960s, there have been plans for this. There were even thoughts that the Americans may assist in this by effectively laying a whole heap of small nuclear mines along this pathway to blow out and excavate the pathway for the Ben Gurion Canal. Now, the Ben Gurion Canal itself, if it's put in place, will have major economic and geopolitical ramifications in this area. It will mean that the Suez Canal, now if we're just looking here on the map here, this on the screen here on the right, the Suez Canal, it would now have a competitor. This is it just here. It would now have a competitor in the Ben Gurion Canal. It would save on some routes in terms of the distance you would have to travel. It would be over here closer to Jordan, Syria. It would certainly, if you were looking to exploit the oil and gas reserves under the West Bank and those just off the coast of Gaza, then having this canal here, which would allow access from the Mediterranean through to the Red Sea and beyond, would make someone like Israel a major player in the energy game. Now, energy is what it's all about. If you want to be a developing nation and you want to develop, or if you are a developed nation and you wish to continue in being that developed nation, you need energy. There are plenty of graphs that you can see which show energy and growth, economic growth for a nation. And the graphs, they're twinned, they're aligned. Your energy consumption goes up as your development increases. The things that we like to do with science and travel and technology and development and building require energy. The standards of living that we like to have in the developed world and those that we wish to obtain and increase require lots of energy. Anyone who's watching this episode, if you're watching this show, you're consuming a considerable amount of energy. You're either charging your mobile phone and watching it on your mobile phone, or you're at home and you're watching it on a monitor or a laptop or a computer somewhere. You get the picture. You understand. Now, in the last few months, we've had a number of threats to the traditional global energy sources. We've had the conflict in Ukraine. Now, the conflict in Ukraine has been dreadful for Europe in terms of energy. The ready supply of cheap Russian gas has been, if not turned off for many European nations, it has been directly turned off, and those nations have been forced to source Russian gas and oil through intermediaries, through third-party players. Just today, US Secretary of State Anthony Blinken has arrived in India. He's there with Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, and they are doing a series of meetings in India. Now, interestingly, they are saying that they are not talking about what's happening in Gaza and Ukraine, but they are there talking. Now, one of the things that I'm sure they will be talking about is the recent announcements that the Russian average price for Russian barrel of oil is $74 now. Now, the West imposed a year or more, just over a year ago, a price cap of $60 per barrel. That's just been blown through. Now, part of that is due to nations like India buying Russian oil, and then mixing it with a little bit of Saudi oil, and then suddenly it's okay to be then sold to Europe. So which means that Europe is getting its Russian oil, but it's getting it at a premium. So I imagine the part of the conversation that Blinken will be having down there will be something along those lines of, Stop playing this intermediary. If you need Russian oil, fine, buy it for yourself, India, but don't then go and on-sell it at a profit to Europe. We need to, they want the sanctions to actually have an effect on Russia. Anyhow, energy is what it's about. So we've had the Ukraine conflict, which has put pressure on Europe getting energy. We've also had Niger, the coup there, and the cessation of the supply of uranium to France. Now, France is the European nation with the largest dependency on uranium. About 70% of their about 70% of their electricity generation is generated via nuclear power plants, and about 20%, maybe a little more, of France's raw unprocessed uranium came from Niger. So with that now stopping, Europe has got further energy problems. Interestingly, there were reports over the last week or so that an Iranian foreign minister speaking to the leaders of Niger, those who formed the coup, and looking at establishing relations with them. Now, that will also have the West concerned, as they know that Niger has large supplies of uranium, and they know that Iran wants uranium supplies. Iran is in a situation where they are a somewhat fragile nation in terms of their ability to be able to trade globally. They are, considered to be one of Israel's enemies. There are many in the West and in the US who would love to war with Iran. So Iran has a desire to be able to join the club of those nations that do have their own nuclear weapons and the capability to produce them. So Israel, opaque on the matter, but many believe that Israel do have nuclear capability. Even if they don't have their own, it's quite possible that the Americans have provided them some form of nuclear protection, in much the same way that, for example, Turkey. Now, Turkey is a nation that does not produce its own nuclear weapons, but it is a NATO member, and as part of a NATO nuclear weapon sharing agreement, Turkey hosts somewhere between 60 and 70 American nuclear warheads within Turkey itself. This is done as part of the non-proliferation treaty to effectively say, look, you can have the protection of nuclear weapons. We will lend you some of ours to stop you going and developing your own. So, effectively the US, the West, curtailing Turkey from gaining the capability of developing their own nuclear weapons, and instead saying, here, put these ones in here. It's part of NATO, so you can use them if you needed to protect yourself. Now, interestingly, I might come back to this later on in this talk, is that if what's happening in the Middle East and Gaza with Ukraine were to escalate and Turkey were to enter the fight, and if they were to engage in a full war with Israel, then any likelihood of Israel using nuclear weapons against Turkey would see one of two things happening. Pakistan, who are a nuclear power, have about 170 nuclear warheads reportedly, have committed that they would support Turkey. If Turkey were in a conflict with Israel and they were attacked by Israel with nuclear weapons, then Pakistan would provide Turkey with nuclear weapons. So Turkey could end up with nuclear weapons that way. Also, there are these 70 warheads in Turkey. Now, they're NATO, they're American warheads. But if things were to change, that's not to say that Turkey would not be able to just assume control of those warheads and use them for their own purposes, which would be an unusual and interesting situation and turn of events if ultimately Turkey were to use American-supplied nuclear weapons against Israel, and Israel was using American-supplied nuclear weapons against Turkey. Anyhow, so yeah, getting back to this, we've got these threats on traditional energy supplies, primarily impacting Europe. We've got when I say recent, it's been the last sort of 4 years or so. I think it was maybe about 2019 or 2020 that the major discoveries of the oil and gas reserves under Gaza and off the shore of Israel and under the West Bank and off the shore of Gaza and Israel were discovered. So in a time when many nations are wondering, what may happen in the coming years in terms of energy, how do they secure energy, this may be an undercurrent, something pushing and putting pressure on the situation from underneath. The Israelis perhaps looking to secure Gaza and the West Bank. There has been already in the tactics employed by the Israelis in the conflict in Gaza, we've seen that there has been a cutting off of the northern area of Gaza. The IDF forces surrounding on the northern, the eastern, and then splitting up through part of Gaza, allowing now 3-hour windows each day for civilian residents of Gaza in the north of the Strip to move to the south. There has been obviously a large flow of Palestinians from the north to the south, and there is talk that this is part of the Israeli plan to, as they eradicate the Hamas fighters from Gaza, to push the Palestinian civilians closer and further south and closer to the border with Egypt, on the Sinai region there, down towards the Rafah crossing. And some suggest find a way to force them into the Sinai area and then close the border and not let them back in. Now, this topic has drawn a lot of commentary in the news and social media, people talking about the fact that the Arab nations surrounding Israel, West Bank and Gaza, nations like Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, have been very resolute in their position of not accepting Palestinian refugees as part of this conflict. A lot of people in the West have said, look at this. Why should anyone else consider taking refugees? The other Arab nations won't. I think that one of the reasons that the Arab nations don't want to do this, there's a number of reasons. Obviously, if you were to say, sure, if Egypt were to say, sure, we'll just accept 2.5 million people from Gaza, and give us all the people in the West Bank as well, then you've got a problem that you've got to deal with in your country there. And that volume of people turning up, you've got to house them, you've got to feed them, you've got to find a way to support them. These are challenges for any nation. Europe is struggling under the same challenges now with their immigration from Africa, Middle East, that sort of thing. They're suffering problems, which is very public at the moment. So that's one reason. Another reason is that there is a concern from those Arab states that if they were to accept those Palestinian residents of Gaza and the West Bank as refugees, that Israel would not let them back in, and that by accepting them, they would have in effect stopped any possibility of the Palestinian people arriving at a position where they do have a state within the area of Israel. The concern is that once they had left, that they would not be allowed back in, and that Israel would then assume control of the Gaza Strip, would populate the Gaza Strip, and would complete the Israeli population of the West Bank area. And this would then allow Israel unfettered access to the oil and gas reserves that are underneath those areas. Now, sharing those oil and gas reserves with the Palestinians, you can imagine, is a threat for the Israelis. The Gaza Strip was under blockade, was still under blockade, been under blockade for about 16 years, was occupied by the Israelis. Everything that goes in and out of the Gaza Strip is policed and controlled by the Israelis. So if suddenly you were to say, Gaza, you've now got half of that $520 billion or whatever it might be, they would never get half of it. But if they were just to say, even get a fraction, a sizable fraction of that, suddenly in Gaza, you would have the Palestinian people there and the Hamas organization with billions of dollars at their disposal. Suddenly, this means that they become powerful in their own right, at least in terms of being powerful in terms of a short-term military capability. If you've got billions of dollars, you can start to buy things. Now, it's difficult to get them into the area, but who says you don't just buy some things in Yemen and get Yemen, the Houthis in Yemen, to fire the rockets for you at Israel? There are ways around that. There are ways to use your money without having to spend them in the state that you're in. So this Ben Gurion Canal, the benefits that it would provide to Israel of having a waterway, a connection running through Israel from the Eastern Mediterranean to the Red Sea. Obviously, there's billions of dollars to be made in that's freight and shipping taxes there, as occurs at anywhere where you've got that kind of capability. The Panama Canal, the Suez Canal, through the Bosphorus in Turkey. There are taxes levied on the freight that travels through those waterways. This would mean that Egypt would be weakened. It would lose revenue. Israel would be strengthened. It would pick up revenue. And if you are going to plan to go out there and then capture, mine, extract the oil and gas from the Mediterranean and from under the West Bank area, you now are perfectly positioned to ship that north and west through the Mediterranean or south down through the Red Sea. It's always interesting, I think, when you see these conflicts, to try to it's interesting when you learn about some of the other layers that are at play there. Here, for example, I wouldn't say that this topic is widely discussed as being a part of this. Everything is focused on the conflict. Everything is focused on what happened on October the 7th with the Hamas attack. And there's still a lot of the commentary on this, and a lot of the thinking still seems to be very short-minded in terms of the time frame that is considered. I hear a lot of people saying Israel is completely within its rights to defend itself because of the attack that Hamas has performed. even some intellectual, I guess you would have called them semi-intellectual heavyweights, people who have been, or at least intellectual populists who have been prominent in social media over the last few years. Douglas Murray is one example. Taking very one-sided opinions on the topic. Douglas Murray, for example, I understand where he is coming from, in that he is looking again beyond just the conflict today, and looking more from a religious and ideological perspective, where he is seeing the differences between Muslim ideology and Christian ideology, and using that, I believe, as his reason and justification for his it seems to me, one-sided support of Israel in this conflict. I think you've got to look backwards and forwards. This conflict itself hasn't been going for a month. For 75 years, this conflict has been ongoing. But also in the current month-long era of the conflict, I don't think that you can take the one-sided view here. I think you need to be able to say Israel has a right to defend itself. Palestinians have a right to defend themselves. As I've said before, you don't just wake up one morning and go and murder your neighbour. If that type of event occurs, something has been going on. Usually some time. There's been something that has precipitated it, something that has got you to the position that you want to put it all on the line and run the risk of dying yourself, going to prison for life, whatever it might be, to go and murder your neighbour. Now, Gaza, Hamas, the attacks on Israel, there have definitely been people saying that this would happen in any case because the Arabs wish to just wipe the Israelis out and remove them entirely. Now, I've heard that. I've also heard from Israelis in the last month the same rhetoric, that that Hamas and the Palestinians should just be wiped out. Now, I don't think either of them are right. I think that there are definitely differences in ideologies here, which will have fundamental differences and long-term will have impacts. But that doesn't mean that you can't find a way to work around them. And you can do that. And we've demonstrated that. We have trade between Muslim and Christians, and Muslim nations and Christian nations. And these things have gone on for hundreds of years, thousands of years. And yes, there have been fights going on for thousands of years. Ideologies are strong things, like people have spoken about recently too, when Anthony Blinken was asked just while he was in Japan earlier this week, G7 talks, how can you stop Hamas? Because Hamas has become an idea. Blinken actually agreed with that point and said, you can't really just kill Hamas. What you need to do is replace the idea with a better idea. Now, Tony Blinken has, interestingly, been a supporter of the two-state solution. He has been publicly stating that Israel needs to manage its response. The Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, has rejected that. Tony Blinken's diplomacy attempts over the last couple of weeks have not gone well for him. He has been forced to wait for Saudi prince to meet him, wait all night. He has arrived in Turkey and been met by no one at the airport, and then only met with ministers, wasn't granted a meeting with President Erdogan. There were photos of Tony Blinken in Iraq, I believe it was, early this week, waiting on the tarmac, wearing a flak jacket, body armor. These are unusual scenes for the Secretary of State. It's not the sort of thing that you would normally see him needing to do, being in a position where he would feel, or his entourage would feel, that threatened. It gives an indication, perhaps, of how American influence in the Middle East has diminished. But his diplomacy overall has not gone well. But he has been supporting or talking about what might happen in the near future. And this raises some good questions. What is going to be the outcome here for Israel? What is Israel's goal here? Now, the stated goal is to destroy Hamas. Very difficult thing to do and to quantify. Without destroying all of the Palestinians in Gaza, how do you know that you've destroyed Hamas? So there's that question. But let's just say that Israel continues its bombing campaign in Gaza and does reach the point where it's no longer receiving insurmountable resistance, and it claims that it has won the conflict and beaten Hamas. The governorship of the Gaza area is then a question. Who will govern and control that area? Now, this is where Blinken and Netanyahu seem to differ, in that Tony Blinken is saying there needs to be a peaceful leadership for Gaza. Netanyahu, I think, is of the position of Israel will control Gaza after this conflict until such time that they are satisfied that the area is safe. Now, while that may appear to work for Israel, isn't going to work for the Palestinians, who don't want to be back under Israeli rule in Gaza. So there's going to be an immediate challenge with what happens there in terms of diffusing the conflict, because even if Israel gets to the point where they think they can stop, or if Israel gets to the point where they are forced to stop, and that's a very real possibility for them at the moment. What happened on the 7th of October with the Hamas attacks, and in the age that we're in with social media, where video footage of attacks was all over the planet almost immediately, there was an initial wave of support for Israel. However, in the subsequent weeks, with the continuous bombing, with the daily videos of Palestinian children who have been blown up and killed, the video of just bomb strike after bomb strike destroying apartment blocks in Gaza, that initial wave of support for Israel is ebbing away, and it is being replaced by support for the Palestinian people. Now, again, a lot of the Western media seems to try to paint this as support for Hamas I don't believe that it is a great deal of support for Hamas. I think it is support for the Palestinian people and the civilians. That people can easily see video footage confirming them being killed and attacked and bombed. We've got major protests all over the Western world. Australia, New Zealand, America, Europe, UK. Reports of large protests in all these countries, European nations as well. This is is what I guess you would term as a groundswell event, and it is going to put pressure on politicians. If the general public perceive this as being heavy-handed from Israel against mostly defenseless civilians, not the Hamas fighters, but the civilians of Palestine, who have a very large percentage of children, a large percentage of the Palestinian population is under the age of 30, then that causes problems for governments who then commit to support Israel. Now, Joe Biden has got himself into this position, it seems. His very early trip over to Israel to talk to Benjamin Netanyahu and to promise, their ironclad support, unending support for Israel, means that if in, let's say, a few weeks, Israel starts to try to close down Hamas by sending in more ground forces, their casualties rise, and they are put under political pressure. Benjamin Netanyahu is put under political pressure such that they are forced to withdraw. Then this conflict may appear as though it were a loss for Israel and a loss for the United States, who are their primary backer. Now, the United States does not want two losses in a row, and at the moment they're riding the slow back of a loss in Ukraine. It's gone from Ukraine will win, or Ukraine is winning, to whatever it takes, to looks like we might be in a stalemate, to pretty soon it's going to be we're negotiating with Russia and Russia has taken half of Ukraine. That's a loss. Coming into the election next year in November, Biden has got that to deal with. The conflict in Gaza, if it could have been a quick and decisive American-supported win, which it has not been, that opportunity is already gone. It's been a month and it's not been a quick and decisive win. That could have given Biden a bump. They could have just, put away all of the talk about Ukraine, which to a large extent is happening. For those of you who follow Twitter in particular, in the last 2 weeks, the volume of the NAFO crowd on Twitter has just fallen through the floor. It makes me wonder how many of those pro-Ukrainian accounts were bots, how many were real people who have just now realized over time that Ukraine is not winning and have then just given up or hung their heads in shame. I don't know why they've stopped, but the volume has decreased. And Ukraine in the news has just fallen behind the conflict in the Middle East. So Biden might, further that if he was successful here in Gaza with this conflict, backing Israel, could have made that the win, could have tried to ride that into the November election. As it's looking now, it's possible that the US could be on the back of 2 losses in a row, a destroyed Ukraine and Russia rolling to the Dnieper River, taking the Kharkov region all the way up to Kiev, taking Odessa, reuniting Transnistria with the greater Russia, and stopping at that point. I don't think they want anything more than that, as well as perhaps a defeat or a perceived defeat in the conflict with Hamas. On the other hand, what we might find, and this can't be ruled out unfortunately, is that the neocons, the hawks in Washington, like Newland and Blinken, the very pro, Ukraine anti-Russian crowd, may get to the point where they say, well, we can't have two losses here. But what always works well, or what generally works well in the US, is going into an election is a war president, a president who's seen to be fighting a war. So maybe what we do is we escalate in the Middle East. So it's not Israel has backed out of Gaza for political reasons and that's seen as a defeat. Instead, we inflame things and we get ourselves into a real good fight. And we do that in the months leading up to the election, and that gets Joe Biden back in, and that gets us 4 more years to figure out what we want to do here. Now, I'm not saying that's going to happen, but I am saying that that is a possibility here. The Biden administration, the people behind them, the Democratic Party, do not want to lose the election. They do not want to lose the election. They especially do not want to lose the election to Trump. And it looks like Trump is the front runner, the person who, if it comes down to it, will get the votes and will beat Biden. And the Democrats don't have a great candidate. Kamala Harris isn't it. Gavin Newsom isn't it. Trump's got a lot more flair than anyone that the Democrats are able to offer at this stage. So they don't want to lose. If Israel blows the PR here and the Western political backing begins to get cold feet and turn against them, then this loss could happen. And if that loss is to be avoided, then one way to do that would be some form of escalation in this area. Now, for Israel, this is bad. Israel had the opportunity on the 7th of October to take some sort of a measured response to deal with the savage and tragic events that happened, but deal with it in a more of a calm and measured way. A 4-week continuous bombing campaign against an adversary who has no air force, no ability to bomb you back, has only rockets, many of them are reportedly homemade type of rockets, is just not a good look. And it's gone on for long enough now that members of the general public who don't really know what's going on generally, it's starting to filter through to them. So that's not good. The position that Israel is in now is not good. If the situation is inflamed, so if Hezbollah in Lebanon decide that they are joining the conflict, or if Israel's ground offensive flounders and they decide to up the level of bombing, or they decide to actually try to push all of the Palestinians out and right to the south of Gaza and begin bombing further south, or if they decide to have a go at the West Bank and the West Bank gets involved, then someone like Turkey and President Erdogan in the last week or so has given some very rousing speeches. Turkey is a very strong military force. They are good fighters. They have the largest army in European NATO. They can stand up an army relatively rapidly of a large size. I've heard reports that they have a reserve army of up to 2 million people. Now, if Turkey, with President Erdogan being head of the Muslim Brotherhood, if they decide that they will unite in support of the Palestinians, then Israel has a real problem. Yes, America has 2, possibly up to 4 aircraft carriers in the area, but aircraft carriers are very precious pieces of equipment. Yes, they let you launch aircraft. However, they have limitations. They need to be able to provide fuel to those aircraft. So you've got to be able to maintain those fuel supplies. So those aircraft can't necessarily fly that far. With the threat of Russian MiG-31s in the Caspian Sea and the southern Black Sea with the Kinjal missiles on them, those hypersonics, just say they were engaged for whatever reason, those aircraft carriers are at risk. And so if they're lost, then suddenly the large American force in that area is diminished. Israel is in real problems then. If they're being attacked by Hamas, if they're being attacked by Hezbollah, if they have got Iranian supported forces pouring in from Syria, if the Houthis in Yemen continue their attacks, if it gets to the point where Turkey decides to engage, then the calculus changes, because then there's a very good chance that they will say, Iran, are you going to join us? And Iran is very likely to then join. They don't want to be seen to not support Turkey. So you could have Turkey and Iran beginning to attack Israel. At that stage, if that's happening, then who knows what Saudi Arabia might do. While Saudi Arabia might not join in directly, they might say, sure, use our bases. We're all Arabs. We don't want to get caught up in the middle of this and not be seen to be supporting Muslim nations. So Israel is in a bad situation now with the way that they have handled October the 7th response. But if they don't manage it very well now, it could become far, far worse for them. And now, yes, I've heard people say, oh, well, if Turkey kicks off against Israel, America will just blast everyone. Now, look, you're right. Let's just say we're not at the nuclear stage yet. Then, yes, America has some bases there. America will have its aircraft carriers there. But, as I say, they need to be supported and maintained. And if you have got Turkey and Iran in the fight, yeah, it'll be a fight, but Israel will be wrecked in that fight. Just like Ukraine is being wrecked in the fight with Russia. The fighting is going to be happening in Israel. The fighting isn't going to be happening back home in the States. It will be happening there in Israel, and Israel will be wrecked at the end of it. Right now, if Hamas's intent was to cause damage to Israel, then Israel's current response is playing right into Hamas's hands. Because if it continues and it's seen as being heavy-handed and support fails, then Israel becomes weakened or seen to have to back out and be weakened in that area, if that forces Israel to do something rash and Turkey and Iran become involved, then Israel gets smashed, which is perhaps just what Hamas was after in the first place. So that's some of my musings anyhow, what could be happening here. One interesting thing too, which I wasn't aware of until just the other day, but just the Houthis in the Yemen war, there have been 6 US aircraft and 22 UAE aircraft and 63 Saudi Arabian aircraft shot down. Now, some of those aircraft have been F-16s, Black Hawks, Ospreys, MQ-9 Reapers, Mirage warplanes, Apache helicopters. So this has just been, in the war with Yemen, there's been 80, 90, aircraft, Western aircraft shot down, with a number of them being F-16s, 3 or 4 F-16s, it looks like. Which I think just shows that in a conflict in this area, if that's what Yemen can do, then if you've got the likes of Turkey and you've got Iran, then the American military forces in that area will not come out of it unscathed, and they will suffer losses, losses like they've not seen since Vietnam, I suppose. In the fighting since then, all of the US fighting has generally been against nations where the American air superiority has given the Americans a solid advantage. But here, this could turn into a different conflict. All right, I haven't really covered off too much about Ukraine tonight. Ukraine. I might do something on over the weekend. What we're seeing there in the last week is the slow, relentless swelling of Russian force. There are Russian advances in 5 or 6 positions along the main line of combat from the north and the Kupiansk area down through Bakhmut, Donetsk, and Avdiivka, even Klishchiivka, and then down through Zaporozhye. And in Kherson, it looks as though the Russians are just letting the Ukrainians come across the Dnieper in small numbers and then bombing them. Basically just using the river as a defense line and then just opening the gate sort of when they want to, allowing some Ukrainian troops across, bombing them, saying send some more over and bombing them. The Russians aren't looking to advance across the Dnieper in Kherson yet. But they certainly are attriting the Ukrainian forces that are getting on the rivercraft and getting across the islands. Avdiivka, the pincers are slowly being brought together over the last couple of weeks. It's gone from reportedly a 9-kilometre gap from the northern to the southern pincers around the north of Avdiivka. That's gone from 9 to 7 to 6, I think I saw yesterday. So the Russians are advancing around there. The supply ability of the Ukrainians in Avdiivka is being dramatically restricted. Some of the Ukrainian telegram channels reportedly from Ukrainian forces in Avdiivka are not telling a happy and confident and positive story. They are talking about the fact that they are just being hammered. There's video footage coming out yesterday, which, if it's correct, was showing groups of Ukrainian forces retreating or evacuating reportedly out of Avdiivka. This was guys walking along, helping other guys who'd been injured, guys with bandages around their heads and that sort of thing, and just walking out. President Zelensky has been making video requests for money. If you can't donate money, give us a loan, apparently. General Zaluzhny has been giving interviews and saying that the offensive is over and that they are in for tough times. The Ukrainians are still pouring resources into Avdiivka, have still been fighting around Robotne and Verbova, and reportedly have not been taking the time to invest in developing fortifications, strong reinforcing positions behind the current front line, so that if the Russians do decide to make a push, that they are able to defend. There are reports now that the Ukrainians are in a weak defensive position, and that as they begin to be forced back, that they will be falling back onto unprepared defenses, and they are likely to just be chased, in some reasons, back to the Dnieper. The situation overall for the Ukrainians is just dreadful. It's just shit, basically. They've, as John Mearsheimer said, that they have been wrecked. The country has been wrecked. It's in the process of just being destroyed. And when this conflict does end, and now there are rumors and whispers going on now that the US, the West, is at the point of saying to Zelensky that you need to go and negotiate because we've got to wind this up. We don't have ammunition to give you anymore. And the ammunition we do have, we're giving to our better mates, the Israelis now. We're busy over there. Really prefer not to be fighting on two fronts. The plan to weaken Russia backfired in our face. Russia is far stronger, pumping out millions and millions of shells now. We're struggling to catch up, and we're not going to catch up for years if we ever do catch up. So basically, sorry, as long as it takes, well, it means as long as we could do it, we can't do it anymore. So the coming months are going to be very, very tough. The funding for Ukraine, the original funding that was provided, John Kirby was interviewed, and he announced this week that they said 96% of the original funding for the Ukraine has now been consumed. So they're down to the dregs. Without a large injection of funding, that 60 billion that they're looking for, without that and more, then 2024 is going to be a dreadful year for Ukraine in terms of the conflict, because they'll be starting 2024 without the funding that they had, without all the military and NATO equipment that they had. Remember that Poland and France and Slovakia have all decided that nope, they're not providing any more military equipment. The military support they're going to provide now will be in terms of investment in factories and things to develop weapons in Ukraine, but those factories, as soon as they're built, will be bombed and destroyed by the Russians, so that's not going to happen either. So 2024, without the financial funding, without the equipment, more importantly, without the manpower. The reports of the Ukrainian losses are just staggering. It's 500,000 men reportedly killed, somewhere near that number. Even if that's out by 100,000, that's still a massive number. The average age of the Ukrainian fighting force in the last year has gone from an average age of 27 to an average age of over 40. That's not because Zelensky is protecting the youth. That's because all those young blokes have been killed or wounded, and they're having to draw on the older men from their society to fight. So they've not got the men to fight. They're talking about drafting women into the conflict to fight. They're expanding the net that they can cast to draw people into the conflict. People who are unwell, mentally unwell, people who are unfit, physically unfit, are now able to go and fight. The amount of training they're receiving before being sent to fight is reportedly minuscule. So it's a terrible situation now. They've got the winter to come. Now, as I was reading yesterday, in terms of some areas too, like Avdiivka, unlike some of the other fortress type areas which Ukraine was looking to defend, where they had strong or multiple supply routes in and strong areas just behind or just north to help them supply. In Avdiivka, they don't have that. The main rail lines on the way in are already coming under heavy artillery fire. They're getting down to one supply road left, which is under Russian fire control. And to the east of Avdiivka, the Russians have Donetsk City and massive supply lines and easy rotations. So as it comes into winter, the Russians will be out on the front line fighting for Avdiivka. They'll rotate back safely, quickly and easily. Their losses will be low because they'll be getting good medical attention, whereas the Ukrainians will be fighting there. They'll be fighting to get into the area. They'll be fighting to get out if they've been wounded and injured, and it will be cold and freezing, and they're not going to have easy supply. So their morale is going to be low. So, yeah, what is coming for the Ukrainian men is just hell as the winter is rapidly approaching. Even the civilians of Ukraine, it's going to be tough. There have been reports that Russia has been stockpiling some missiles because they want to go in and really put the pressure on as winter arrives by taking out the energy infrastructure in Ukraine. Now, I'm sure that this will be targeted to put pressure in particular areas and not just wipe out everything, because I think particularly in areas, as I said, east of the Dnieper in Odessa, I imagine that will be measured because the Russians will want to occupy that land and they want to destroy all the energy infrastructure there, but you don't need to destroy everything to turn power off. But that's going to become tough. Plus, if the funding dries up, there's just no money in Ukraine to pay people, even public servants, the police force, the fire brigades, all of that will just shut down after 2 weeks of no pay for people. There'll be mass exodus. The border of Poland will be just crawling with Ukrainians if that happens, if they run out of money and the fighting continues. And it won't be able to continue for too long because there'll ultimately be rioting in Bankova and Zelensky will be thrown out or hung or something, because the people of Ukraine will just have had enough once the power goes off and the money stops and the food stops. And that's a very real possibility of what will happen if Ukraine doesn't get to the negotiating table with Russia soon. Unfortunately for Ukraine, there will be very little negotiating going on because they just don't hold any cards. They're negotiating with nothing. It will be a case of Russia saying, we are going this far and we will stop and you will replace Zelensky and whoever you put in will be Russian friendly and there will be no NATO. And if that's not the case and you don't agree to that, then we will just destroy the west of you until someone agrees. That's the brutal truth, as I see it, of what Ukraine is facing. The faster they get to negotiate with Russia and basically say, if you want Odessa, you have it, just take it, just give us in a couple of weeks to let everyone who doesn't want to be in Odessa to move out. It's yours. Yep, we'll replace Zelensky with someone who's not going to be a NATO guy, and then let's just get back to fucking doing let's just sell stuff and trade and just get on, try and fix some things. All right, that's it's good to be back doing these shows. I enjoy it. I don't know why I enjoy it, but I do. I don't even know if anyone's watching them, but if you are, I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll talk to you soon.